Hello and welcome. My name is Shanice Freel and I am currently about to take you through the latest installment of the Body Mind Connection series called Adolescence. I have split it into parts. I wanted to do this into one presentation, but it's impossible, right? Due to the nature of the content and how comprehensive it is. I've tried to simplify as much as possible, but I'm not finding it easy. So I'm taking you through these parts now because the first one for today is called the Profane. It's called the Profane because we're looking at the darker elements of institutionalised education and how that is shaping AuDHD teenagers in an extremely negative way, right? And I've looked at it in depth and I've tried to simplify as much as possible, but because of how important the information is and what I've found is so specific, you may see for the first time where I've directly lifted from my sources, word for word, right? Because I don't want to miss out any of this, right? I'm prepared to be shocked. As it stands, the problem that we are trying to resolve here with my team at Sincerity Schools is that we are building an educational model specifically for AuDHD children and teenagers. And we are looking at nervous system regulation and neurological pathways and allowing for full development of those pathways and full alignment between the head and the heart. So there's a process and a methodology that I'm developing called the Body Mind Connection that looks at child and learning development as one and the same, because learning is interlinked with biological evolution, right? So it's biology first, right? We're looking at the biological development of the child and the teenager and allowing that to inform the model that we build to decrease the likelihood of dissociation or the instances of dissociation, and to decrease the instances of trauma or misattunement, which causes the child to be, or the teen to develop unhealthy things called false compensations, which are coping mechanisms for dysregulated nervous systems underneath a lot of masking. So what happens with, and this is the easiest way to explain it, AuDHD children, they come in full and whole. What the world and our perception of them does is, because we haven't met their needs so far, is it starts to break them up into jigsaw pieces. In childhood, we rebuild their wholeness, right? By erasing the bonds or the fractures between pieces, right? Allowing for full development of their synapses, their connectivity, their connection between the head and the heart, constantly returning them to their body awareness and giving them an education around emotion processing, which is integral to healthy development. If we do not process emotions at depth and in full, which 99.9% of the population currently are not doing to the depth that we need to, it limits and locks them into developmental phases that are lower than their age, right? When we get to teen years, what starts to happen is that the brain starts to prune the way that the nervous system and the brain connect. It starts to break off things that are not practiced, right? And if the child is in a state of dysregulation already from childhood, or they are in chronic stress, there is an extreme likelihood of developing structural dissociation, whereby they have quite literally little personalities, which are their jigsaw pieces, running to cope with their problems, avoiding emotions underneath, and blocking them from full development. So they end up adults who are actually children inside of grown bodies, and they are in states of suffering that are largely unconscious. So the urgency with which I speak today, I apologise, I am being a little heavy, but it's because of the nature of what I've found here. I'm quite shocked. I wasn't expecting to come across what I have, right? And as a consequence, I am very keen to address it in full. So I've broken adolescence, the sacred and the profane of AuDHD attachment. And attachment is just one aspect of what I'm going to look at. I thought it was going to be just attachment, but there's way more to it. It's just one part of what I'm going to look at. I'm going to be looking today at the Profane specifically, and what institutionalised education actually does to the development of adult AuDHD teens. We essentially, through institutionalised education that doesn't meet their needs, are placing them in time loops that they will not have the tools to recover from if they continue in the curriculum that they are in currently. Now, as someone who has had structural dissociation active in me to an extreme where I developed dissociative identity disorder, and it was multiple personalities and spinning through them according to nervous system states, and I was polyfragmented, so there were multiple instances of disruption due to trauma in my past. I have reversed all of that with really, the word I'm getting is cogent, mightn't be right, cohesive and powerful information around how to reintegrate all of these parts inside of us. I fully believe, with the research that I've done and the things that I've learned and seen, that structural dissociation is in all of us, and it's in fact running our behaviour, and it's caused by low to no emotion processing and maladaptive behaviours that we pick up in our teenage years. That's how integral this passage is. And I called it the sacred and the profane for a reason, because what we're doing right now is profane. It is astoundingly wrong, right? And is causing no end of damage to the young people in our lives currently. And we may not be conscious of this, so I'm going to disclose all of it today. And then in the next session, I'm going to look at adolescence as a sacred passage and demonstrate through research and through the plans that we're making with Sincerity Schools how we can seek to either reverse the effects of structural dissociation or equally create healthy, safe, open, curious, integrated sense of self through adolescence. One that teaches the children to see themselves, their social, emotional and sexual health and sexual well-being and knowledge of all that as sacred, as is the approach for Eastern tradition and ancient spiritual practice. I'm going to integrate a lot of that, and I'm going to simplify it really clearly. I'm not doing that in this session. This will be the next one. I have no idea when I'm going to do the next one. It might be later today, it might not be later today. I've been quite busy, right, and I've got stuff to do, so it might not be till Monday, so we'll see, right? But I'm going to get to the profane now, where I'm going to talk you through exactly what institutionalised education is doing and why it's not working. Right, okay, so let's go. Don't want multiple windows, would you ever slide on? Right, hang on. Great, you're going to make my life difficult now, or my thing doesn't appear. That's lovely, thanks very much for that. Now, very happy. Cheers, hey. Right, excuse me while I go through my drive now when I didn't intend to do so, because I seem to have lost where I was, which is really annoying. Right, okay. Where's my thing? Come on. Load up, please. There it is. Right. Excuse me, almost there. Honestly, okay, there it is. Slideshow. Adolescence, Part 1, The Profane. I will interject from time to time here and make simple what seems complicated on the screen. Hopefully it won't be. So what do we learn during adolescence? A healthy developed sense of self, personal agency, self-reflection, responsibility, emotion regulation, sexual clarity and healthy sexual development. I said sexual clarity because it's a concept that needs to be more explicit for AuDHD children. I'm not so much going into that this session, but I will in the next one. Relationships and communication. So, you know, all the very, very important things for making a healthy adult, right? A healthy, grown-up human being who is responsible and able to function in the world without causing harm, either to themselves or others. So it's extremely, extremely important. Now, the reason why it's important is because those things are largely automated, right? And we mightn't be aware of that, but it's an automatic learning. It's not one we can force. So if we are not making conscious decisions around how we handle young people, these things will be learnt in unconscious ways, or they will choose coping methods that are extremely harmful, and they will be stuck in that imprint for their adult lives, which is super scary, and we don't want that. So risks and blocks to AuDHD development, or to healthy development for AuDHD teens. This is just a quick summary of overall things you may anticipate I will discuss. Imbalanced or inconsistent parental involvement, unhealthy coping mechanisms for hormone surges, increasing drives for autonomy, exploration and risk-taking without appropriate guidance or knowledge about their own needs, unhealthy or imbalanced dependencies on peers or partners, peer pressure, secrecy, masking and suppression, bullying and improper care to sustain selfhood during it, shame cycles, self-harm, mental health difficulties and eating disorders, loss or lack of skills in boundary setting, choice making, etc. Now I want to introduce myself quickly as someone who struggled with all of this, but I was primarily on the spectrum of condition that I believe is gender based for AuDHD females. I was primarily shut down. I didn't have meltdowns unless I was drunk, just being honest, as a teenager, where it all come barreling up then. I experienced shutdown and dorsal vagal collapse, often caused by extreme rejection sensitive dysphoria, and it would cause switching between alters or personalities based on the extreme structural dissociation that I experienced. The added complication of trauma and misattunement, which is something I'll talk about here, in teenage years, embedded the structural dissociation that was formed due to masking efforts, false compensations in order to cope, and I lived with chronic extreme anxiety, and a state of nervousness and freeze states came in when I was in danger, or I couldn't speak, right, and I didn't know how to speak, and I also had low to no sense of self and low to no sense of boundaries, and I looked to other people to define what was right for me, which was really bad. Now, so key AuDHD specific issues: interoception difficulties, that's being able to understand what's going on in the body or around it; alexithymia, being able to understand or access your feelings. Someone described it recently as just feeling anger all the time in teenage years, and I thought that was a really potent interpretation or description, because that's very true. Those with alexithymia tend to have a lot of rage because they can't connect to themselves clearly, and it can be very difficult. It's not their fault. So pervasive drive for autonomy, which from what I'm seeing can be gender specific, right, or at least more enhanced in children, young men, young adults who were male, due to testosterone. Rejection sensitive dysphoria, more likely in girls, due to social preoccupations, which is typical of their gender, and body issues and preoccupation with their sexuality or their physicality, because that's what society has done to them. We are constantly watching them and scrutinizing them. So you see that with both, right? Inability to express feelings or process them at depth, self-esteem issues due to body changes, and sensory issues as well. Now, with alexithymia, interoception issues, all of these other things going on, teenagers are at risk of becoming disconnected from their own bodies when puberty starts. And their interpretation of that may be a direct rejection of their nature, their actual true nature, due to its inconvenience, and how uncomfortable they feel the changes are in their bodies. I really struggled with this. Puberty hit me early. I was about 10. And it was really, really disconcerting. And I was not happy in my own skin. And eventually I developed just really severe insecurity, and then I had acne as well. And as a consequence, I thought I was the ugliest person on earth, and I developed this loop in my mind of shame, which sort of embedded structural dissociation and dissociation patterns inside of me. Any form of criticism or attention on my body caused me to dissociate, and this became so automated that I was coming out of my body when I was even touched, right? And when this becomes something that is then part of my nature, which is what happens in teenage years. It becomes part of my adult construct. It is extremely hard to reverse or even be conscious of, right? So what we're looking at here is the problem, so then we can look at the fix for the next session. So let's move on. So hormones, puberty, and AuDHD. AuDHD brains in teenage years move through the same stages as any neurotypical adolescent, but with marked differences in intensity, timing, and load on already precarious issues such as sensory and emotion processing, attention, and impulse control. The hormones produced during puberty, progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, interact with AuDHD traits to amplify reward seeking, emotional volatility, sleep disruption, and executive function struggles. The big picture here is that the whole brain is compromised before hormonal storms come rolling in. So for AuDHD teenagers, adolescence is hell, unless they're helped. Now, brain maturation, AuDHD, and emotional developmental delay. Now, if a teenager were to enter this period of their life, like puberty and so on, with structural dissociation already present, which is highly likely and is in 80% of instances as far as I'm aware. I don't know how I know that, I just do, right? More than that, more than likely, if I'm honest. Chronic stress or invalidation of emotions during puberty can wire in dysregulated patterns in the body, thus increasing dissociative risk. So in puberty, if we do not support them properly with this process and return to an awareness of their individual body state and treat the process or transition as sacred, which is what they do, for each gender, they treat it as a beautiful spiritual process of connecting to the body and showing deep love to the body, which ultimately rests the nervous system and allows for things to grow and develop naturally. And the child doesn't go through rejection of self in really intense ways and start switching or loads or dissociating loads when puberty comes in. At the minute, we barely educate them on this. We give them head-based information, but we do not use connecting tools. We do not use body work. We do not use breath work. We do not use, self-honouring scripts. We don't teach them self-honouring scripts. At this time period, where what we teach them about their bodies will become ingrained. And that's what it says there, right? Invalidation of their feelings around their bodies and the changes that they're feeling will wire in dysregulated patterns, and how they interpret those dysregulated patterns later on could be distorted by social messages. So these children may, because of puberty being mishandled, start to reject their physicality, and if there is something to explain that externally, then they will lean towards that, not realizing that it was a dysregulated state inside of their nervous system formed in the phase of puberty that has caused them to reject their true nature. And it's not their fault. They are allowed to be the version that they are for whatever gender they believe, whatever gender they are born into. Right? And the health and well-being of a young adult is largely dependent on that passage of puberty being handled sensitively. In the absence of clear models of variance and uniqueness inside of the gender that they inhabit, right? Their sexual, emotional, and personal development in that phase can be very much disrupted. And here's how. Frontal cortex pruning and myelination. Synaptic pruning removes less used connections, while white matter myelination spreads. I don't know if I'm saying that, but myelination. Most of the long words in my world come from, I've experienced them from a two-dimensional perspective. They don't come out of people's mouths because I don't talk to anyone, right? So if I'm saying this wrong, I really don't care. Now, speeds key circuits for planning, inhibition, working memory, and flexible thinking. During childhood and adolescence, synapses... I don't know what I've tried to say there, I made a mistake. Synapses first overgrow, right? Then up to about 40 to 50% of excitatory synapses in prefrontal areas are eliminated between roughly ages 10 to 30. So that's how fast, quick, intensive, powerful and vital development is between ages of 10 to 30. Now, this is intensified between 12 to 20, right? So AuDHD children with low to no emotional support will lose the capacity to self-regulate in their teens for the rest of their life if their internal experience is not something we externally address in all the ways that are possible. So brain maturation and emotional developmental delay, I'll talk about that next. So chronic stress or invalidation of emotions during puberty can wire in dysregulated patterns in the body, thus increasing dissociative risk. So young people who are having intense emotions like friendship breakdowns, disconnection from their own physicality, feeling rejected, feeling suppressed, feeling overwhelmed by some of the new drives that they're feeling, like sexual drives, emotional drives, drives to explore, all that kind of stuff, will start to judge themselves, right? And then their behaviors become maladaptive practices, and it's all about unshaming this process so then dissociation doesn't happen in relation to this very sensitive time. Okay, so AuDHD, adolescence, and social RSD, right? Rejection sensitive dysphoria and pervasive drive for autonomy. These two things are listed, right, as kind of intense issues in schools currently with AuDHD children. And as far as I understand it, they're a product of chronic dysregulation, usually caused by structural dissociation or trauma in early childhood. That's my interpretation. And they are compensations for key gender-specific issues. Now, these issues may flip depending on how the child has been raised, or how they've responded to puberty, right? Where there could be a disconnect between the masculine or the feminine aspects of their physicality, right? And then this becomes an issue. So let's listen to this, right? And it's a direct lift because I don't want to get any of this wrong. For many girls with AuDHD, repeated social rejection and criticism in a context of obligations to please others create a pattern of unpredictable, inescapable relational threat, encouraging freeze or dissociative responses and anticipatory anxiety around rejection. This intensifies risks of dissociation. Basically, AuDHD girls more likely to experience repeated social rejection and criticism due to the social construct that they live within. There's enormous focus on their bodies and their social engagement, and also their brains are wired to sort of lean towards that. So there will be the potential for freeze or dissociative responses in relation to socializing. And that'll increase masking, and they will be in dissociated states, not realising they are masking, and have absolutely no access to their own real signals or personal feelings about a circumstance. To give you an extreme example of this, they could be in a situation that is intimate in nature with another teen, and they have no idea that their body is given danger signals because they are dissociated and they are masking at the time, and because of these emotional development being lower, right, their sense of right and wrong is lower, and they become more preoccupied with avoiding rejection on a subconscious level than they do with keeping themselves safe. Very important. Now, for many boys with AuDHD, cultural permission for externalizing anger, coupled with testosterone-related risk and dominance, can bias the system towards fight or flight expressions of autonomy and defense rather than overt dissociation. Though shutdown and collapse also occur, this intensifies risk of dissociation. Now, what I'm telling you here is AuDHD boys, coupled with testosterone, tend to get into fight or flight situations much more quickly. If that is frowned upon, they will suppress, right, which causes its own issues. And the same will be the case for strong sexual desires. I'm going to use a different word now because I realise they bleep me out if I say that word, right? That kind of stuff could overwhelm them, and that would cause dissociative risk. So they start to, basically what happens here with both of these, these children are internally rejecting themselves and their nervous systems are having spikes, and it's caused by these issues. So where we see behaviour problems or suppression in girls, disappearing in girls, and free states or behaviour that is false or appears to be false, is because of avoiding the feeling of rejection. And then boys are rejecting themselves internally and as a consequence behaving like this. The rage is a major thing though too, I'm aware of that, and with improper support around how to process that, it becomes a long-standing dissociative pattern where anger comes in and out they go from their heads and bodies. And again, the risk of that is developing dissociative identity disorder or structured dissociation as a whole, which is an extreme state of trauma and unhappiness where they are flipping personalities or identities when faced with challenge. It can go so extreme as the fact that a mere thought can trigger dissociation or switching. I call it switching rather than splitting. I don't like the word split. They say splitting and I don't like that. It's like, it doesn't make sense. The splits are already there. You're switching through them and avoiding the true self on the internal level. So how does the brain decide what to keep and to lose of the child's neurological functioning? So we talked a little bit about the way the brain prunes. Did I talk about it or did I skip it? Basically, the brain starts to cut away neural paths, right? So brain pathways. And brain pathways are pretty much the pathways that indicate whether or not a child can do something, right? So if it starts to prune things that they need to be healthy grown-ups later in life, there's no reversing that without extreme stress or extreme emotion processing later in their growing up life, on their adult life, right? You want to get to the point where they're handling these issues now when they're low stakes, rather than coming up against those issues in their grown up life that weren't resolved in their teens, right? So creating resolution in circumstances that are new to them, especially full emotional resolution and then reflection around what they've learned, is pathway forming, right? So it's feel an emotion, make a decision, reflect, evolve, right? That pathway, and I'll speak about that in the next session, right? Sorry, that came in really quick there. Pathway resolution, right? To evolve and make neural paths. Okay, right, so this is what we're dealing with here. So the whole the pathway development and pruning process is highly selective. Some regions lose close to half their synapses, others hardly change, and much of this is experience dependent and activity dependent. So if they're not doing some things through avoidance of rejection, or they are doing some things driven by control and fight reflexes, that becomes part of their makeup and their personality when they become driven by their emotions, essentially. That's literally what it's saying. And this is something that becomes part of their imprint that defines their future, right? And we don't want that, right? So the risks to healthy development for teenagers currently are low to no exposure to emotion processing, conflict resolution, or healthy communication, because that's the loop that forms the neural path, right? So, and the connection to the body. So it's sort of, they're both, like, they work in tandem. So overuse of screens, pornography, substances, or secrecy are masking to survive, right? So those are the risks where these pathways get literally pruned and the child becomes less than half of their true self as a result. So AuDHD brains and slowed or altered pruning. Autistic brains often show a surplus of cortical synapses due to slowed pruning. So one side of their brain is not cutting off enough quickly enough. This disrupts excitatory and inhibitory balance. So that's about sensory issues, right? And also integration of information, so they might struggle with that. I think that was me, right? So just they stay immature emotionally and personally. That's immaturity, right? ADHD brains show atypical cortical thinning, which is more rapid and excessive, impairing attention and control. Now, this worries me because they get more defensive, right? With the propensity towards ADHD drives, right? And low impulse control. Their thinning, where these pathways start to thin out faster, is normally driven by their drives. So these drives can be animal drives, and they also can be fight, flight, fight, freeze drives, right? So we just need to be conscious of the output with the ADHD side and the input with the autistic side. So they're low input tolerance and overactive or imbalanced output is what we're kind of seeing here, right? So because pruning is strongly activity and experience dependent, this means genetic or molecular biases influence this, as well as patterns of stress, learning, social input and sensory environments they're exposed to during the window. If we can teach them that there is nothing to fear inside of their own evolution and new things, and nothing to fear from inside or outside, and we continue to reinforce that through experience that is healthy, whole, balanced, works with them rather than against them, isn't forced, then we create change that is positive for the long term, always permanent change to their brains. So what is the effect of mainstream school on adolescent AuDHD development? Now this is where it gets dark. A highly controlling, noisy, agency-crushing environment can push things towards maximum load. The brain keeps and strengthens the wrong connections for survival and defence, and trims back connections that would support curiosity, trust and self-direction. In summary, the system wires itself around shame, threat and overload rather than curiosity, safety, exploration and relationship. That's scary, right? Like, that's a scary thing I just said. What happens inside the AuDHD Charlie mainstream school is extremely frightening. We are forcing them into chronic dysregulation, which increases the chance of dissociation, internalizes their thinking so they become more self-focused. And then the brain is like cutting away and overexpanding their sensitivity to noise because there's no way to regulate it. And they become just noisy, dysregulated, overstimulated, angry, upset, and self-interested adults. Survival means anticipate threat, comply or explode. Shut down feelings and scan for danger so those circuits get reinforced while others get pruned away. The brain already processes more information with atypical pruning patterns. Noise, demand and lack of attuned support hits them much harder and for longer. Over time, this means more meltdowns or shutdowns, more rigid patterns or compulsive behaviours to create predictability, weaker capacity for planning, reflection and self-soothing under stress, and extremely low impulse control. And more shutdown and masking for others. So we see here that we are worsening the AuDHD state through institutionalised education and creating these soldiers who are trying to control themselves because they know that they are out of control. And they have no idea that it is the education they are receiving, the cognitive overload, the sensory overload, and their ill-equipped sense of self due to being mishandled through puberty and through their adolescence. It's not them, it's that is what we should be teaching them. Like, there's nothing wrong with how they function, how they feel, what they are. It is all perfectly natural. But unfortunately, we have been failing these children by not making natural what is natural and forcing them into unnatural states like little angry soldiers, as you see in the top corner. So biology and environment will begin to create the following: a frontal system wired to react fast, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, struggle to pause and think. They'll default to I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm too much, I'm not safe. Underdeveloped, they're underdeveloped in flexible thinking or flexible perspectives, so they can't see options, and particularly with regards to their own self. They lack nuanced self-awareness. My emotions do not define me, they define themselves by their emotions, and they collapse around that state. So the disconnect from head to heart is well established at this point, and they are making up stories around what that is. So they become very frightened of their internal state. And they lean to false compensations, which is something I've talked about in previous videos, in order to cope. So internal brakes on self-harm, risky sex, unsafe relationships or outbursts are faulty. So the internal brakes are gone, right? Because they're being run by their emotions. This leads to this, and this is what makes me the most sad. Now, this particular clip is from Frozen 2. Big fan of the Frozen films, right? I only watched Frozen 2 recently, and I just think it was wonderful. And what you have here is Elsa fallen into a pit of ice. Now, she becomes frozen in time, right, in that film. And this is what we are doing to these children. They will, whatever they experience in the passage of adolescence, if it is not allowing for completion of neural pathway and nervous system rest, where there's learning, emotional regulation or processing, actions taken, reflection of those actions, and safety at the end, right? If we do not repeat those patterns and validate those experiences that they're having, they become enemies of their own bodies. Alarm, shame, and hypervigilance circuits are extremely high. Internal critics and controllers become more active. So if they're already traumatized, these personality cells become more embedded. And I've spoken about that before, where certain alters or personalities in childhood may break off when stress remains chronic, right? And if it's rejection of their selves that is causing the stress, then the personalities they choose are not going to be kind to them. And if they're personality selves that are not kind to others, but it helps them function, then we are developing children that are massively far removed from their true natures. And as young people, we need to do better. Dissociative pathways become more embedded. So this is a pattern they then start to take into their adult life, unbroken. It remains that way. So just to reinforce that point, we are creating teens frozen in time through mainstream education. This is the narcissistic conveyor belt, structural dissociation caused by institution. I will be back with the solution. Speaking of the sacred in AuDHD adolescence, formation of attachment, healthy relating, processes, initiations, transitions we can support, ways to educate that will inform them and expand their opportunity for resolution and safe acceptance of themselves and others. We'll also look at how pornography, right, can massively impact their capacity to relate later in life, and it is a false compensation for many young people, particularly the young boys, at that time due to shame, religious imprints upon them, and also not being met with healthy masculine mirrors for their more animal natures. And there's nothing wrong with their animal nature, right? But if those synapses that they need to direct those urges at humans rather than images are disrupted, causes all sorts of problems later with intimacy and self-identification. Sexual clarity becomes more of an issue, right? And again, we'll talk about suppression and how to address that and resolve it. So we started with the Profane today, and I will be back hopefully Monday or possibly sometime this weekend. I don't know, if I'm quite busy, with the next part. It will be comprehensive because I am deeply invested in this particular topic. I really want to see this resolved, and I'm sure after watching this today you do too. Anyway, I am off. Have a nice weekend, everyone. Sorry to be a Debbie Downer. I'll be in better form Monday, hopefully. Bye.